Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do 7.2. Again, my numbering is just terrible here. And it's the second lecture on equilibrium. So we're just really going to draw just a couple of graphs on this one, just like the last time. But in this one, we're actually going to start in the gap and then see how the economy can maybe correct itself. You kind of move back to equilibrium all by itself and why that might happen as well. So again, you're going to get a question, and the AP or whatever, they're going to start and they'll tell you that the economy is in one of three places, right? So actually, before we even start graphing, you'll get the economy is in equilibrium, in which case you look at what we did in the last video. The economy is in a recession, or the economy is in an expansion. So it's going to be in one of those three places. And if they say you're in an expansion, then you start here. If you're in a recession, you start here. And if you're in an equilibrium, right, then you go back to what we saw at the top of the previous page, right? I don't have that one in front of me. So price levels. Now this one starts by saying expansionary gap. So we're going to start actually, and this is a little bit more complex here, start with the LRAS a little to the left. It'll be easier to draw it this way. You have aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply, right? Just like that. Now, we know this is YF, but the current level of output is Y1, and the current level of prices is PL1. And so we are beyond full employment, right? We're beyond the PPC. If we were to draw like a little PPC, we'd be out here, outside of it. And you could be that way temporarily, right? It's not a permanent condition. Now, this is causing, right, some issues in the economy. And what we would observe is that before this, if you can imagine it was caused by aggregate demand, we used to be kind of way down here. We used to be at that price level. And I'm not going to label it and draw it because otherwise it'll get very messy. But the wages got pushed up, right, from where they were. And the prices got pushed up from where they were, where they used to be. And now they're up here. So prices are high. And in fact, the inflation is too high. And what's going to happen is that eventually, right, your workers are going to start saying, I need a raise to keep up with this higher price level. And they'll say, if you're a supplier, you'd say, well, I need higher prices for my supplies because the price went up. And as that happens, right, it makes it more expensive to produce. And so kind of in the long run, right, this is what would happen, is if you were operating in an expansionary gap, you can't stay in this spot permanently. You basically, in the long run, the costs of production would increase and it would cause aggregate supply to decrease. Because if it's more costly to produce, it reduces aggregate supply. Now, that has the effect of we go from point A to point B. And you can see that the price would rise again, but we'd go from Y1 to YF. And when we're back at YF, that's kind of that like homeostasis. It's where basically now you're at your resting point. So it's not going to keep moving past that once we get to that level at point B. But you can imagine, right, if we started at, let's say, point Z, and then we moved to point A, and now we're back at point B again, you might ask yourself, boy, what was that all good for? Well, it wasn't, right? All it did was, if we just increased aggregate demand, all it did was is it increased the price levels in the long run. So it wasn't a path to more growth, right? So we'd say growth, economic growth, is moving where the YF is. And this didn't do that, right? We went from Z to A to B, and now we're back where we started. But we're not just back where we started. We have higher prices. So that's kind of the downside there. Now, on the other hand, we start in a different type of recession, right? This is a recessionary gap. And so we're going to start LRAS over here, YF right there. And in this one, aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. So now, right, we don't have very much output here, but where did we used to be? Well, we used to be way up here, because if it's an aggregate demand recession, that means aggregate demand initially fell. So aggregate demand kind of went down. So we started at point Z, and now we're starting really the problem at point A, but we know that shortly before that we were at Z. So it used to be prices were way up here, and now they've fallen to this level. And certainly we have too little output. So what we'd say is that in the long run, when the economy kind of corrects itself, is these lower prices mean that employers would get to say to their workers, well, price levels are lower, so I'm not going to raise your wages as much. And if you're a supplier to another company, you sell the sugar and the flour to the donut factory, then you'd say, well, your prices fell, so the price of the sugar and the flour fell, so now it's cheaper to make the donuts. And so we'd say aggregate supply will shift to the right, and it increases. Aggregate supply kind of shifts to the right and increases, and we move down to point B. Now, when that happens, you can see prices are even lower than they were, but we go right back to the full employment level. And again, the mechanism here, how this economy is kind of self-correcting, is really critical. It's the idea that the input prices are changing. And so this initial thing, right, we kind of put this little note, leads to a change in resource prices or input costs, resource or input costs. And that is what causes, so therefore, SRAS changes. So that's what's kind of going on here in this, is that when we went from Z to A here, when we went from Z to A here, that initial thing is changing the resource input costs, which affects aggregate supply, and that's what's causing the economy to kind of self-correct. So there's a lot of people, especially before the Great Depression, actually, who argued that if we just wait around long enough, right, the economy will correct itself. That kind of the underlying fundamentals of the economy mean it'll go back to that long run. It's kind of drawn to that long run full employment level. Now, what some policymakers would say is, if you're deep in a recession like this, this mechanism doesn't always work, right? So that's one issue, is that sometimes the wages don't fall very far, and sometimes the resource prices don't fall very far. And so we find that maybe the aggregate supply doesn't move back to the right. And you can get stuck down here with too little employment. And that would be a trap. You wouldn't want to get stuck down there. That'd be bad, right? A recession's bad. Another aspect of it, the criticism of saying, let's let the economy fix itself, is if we wait around a long time, that's very costly to our society, in the sense that unemployment is costly to human beings, right? We're talking about human lives here. So we don't necessarily need to or want to wait around. That's more of a normative judgment, though. Okay, now the last thing about our lecture is actually connecting the models that we've looked at already. So we'll kind of draw 3 graphs all right next to each other and see how they're kind of connected, right? So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so you can see here. And the first one is ADAS. So this is output and price levels, short run aggregate supply, put a dot, long run aggregate supply, point F, right? And then the second one's going to be a PPC. So we'll say capital goods and consumer goods for that one. And then the third one's a business cycle. We haven't looked at the business cycle in a long time, but it's time and GDP R, or just Y, right? So it's the same axis as down here. And this one is, you've got this kind of trend of capacity, but we know that the economy kind of moves up and down around it. It kind of looks like that. And that's the actual. And last time we looked at it back in unit 1, we said, when you're going down, that's a recession. And when you're going up, that's an expansion, right? Expansions and recessions. So there's a connection between all 3 of these. In fact, all 3 tell you basically the same story in different ways. So we would say, if you're at point A here, then you are also at point A here, and you are where the trend equals the actual over here, right? So you're at the full employment. So A equals full employment. Now, if we had, let's see, I'm going to draw another one over here, AD2. And if we said B, right, well, where would B be? B would be here, right, below full employment. And what would that look like on this picture? Well, it would be, somewhere down here. So B would be a recession. And there would be unemployment, right? And then what if we had way out here, AD3, point C? Well, that would be out here, and that would be out here. So this is an expansionary gap, and unemployment goes up and unemployment goes down. So kind of seeing the connections between these and thinking about output is our kind of key indicator here, right? So that's the B, that's A, that's C as well. So it's kind of really talking about output is really where we're kind of making that connection. If we're below full employment, we're at that B level. That's where we call a recession. If we're at point C level of output, that's an expansion. All right, so hopefully this helped you. See you next time.